Regular viewers will remember a few weeks ago, maybe a month or two ago now, we held auditions for new presenters. This is one that nearly got through the net, didn't you, Mike?
Nearly did.
Yeah, nearly. We dragged him back. Mike Fryer, welcome. I want you to introduce you to all our Revelation viewers tonight. You're going to get to know Mike. When he did his audition, he gave some really good information, and we thought some of that our viewers need to know. So we've asked him to put together some special Live at Nines, and this is the first one. Are you ready to go, Mike?
Thank you, Doug. We're ready to go.
You're ready to go. Let's roll the titles. I'm over to Mike.
Hi, good evening. My name is Mike Fryer, and thank you, Doug, for introducing me. Doug said that if I fail this program tonight, he'll do a dance for us, so he may have to do that. So thank you very much indeed, Doug, for introducing me. The purpose of the program tonight is to discuss the aspect of Jewish refugees from Arab lands, and many of you won't have any idea about this subject because I didn't just until a few months ago. And when I began to read about it, I was quite surprised at the extent and the seriousness of the problem. So I was really encouraged when somebody asked me if I would contact an expert on this subject, Lynn Julius, and Lynn tonight is with us. So welcome, Lynn, to Live at 9 on Revelation TV.
Thank you very much.
Thank you for coming.
Thank you for inviting me.
I know you're going to be a great help to us tonight and give us the information that we need regarding the Jewish refugees from Arab countries. And I know our viewers will be really interested in this subject because many are supportive of Jewish communities around the world and Israel. And I think for our viewers, I think it would be a good idea to get a pen and a piece of paper because Lynn is going to give us some information that will help us to support some of these communities. So get your pens and your paper ready as I ask Lynn the first question, and that is, who are the Jewish refugees from Arab lands?
Well, Jews have always lived in the Middle East and North Africa. In fact, they have been there a lot longer than the Arabs. Some communities have been around since biblical times, Iraq, for instance, or Yemen. And after 1948, which is when Israel was created, almost 1 million Jews, I think the exact figure is 850,000 Jews, were forced to leave their homes and they became refugees. And this issue has long been neglected, unfortunately. We only hear one side of the story. We hear about Palestinian refugees. But the 1948 war actually created two sets of refugees, Jewish refugees and Arab refugees.
And I was interested to see that there are more Jewish refugees than Arab refugees. Why is that?
Well, there were more of them. There were 856,000, as I said. If you include refugees from Iran, that brings the total to more than 1 million. There were perhaps 700,000 Palestinian refugees. The figures do vary. Not all the Palestinians actually left Palestine. Some were internally displaced within Palestine. But the Jewish refugees, in fact, have been almost totally wiped out from their communities in the Arab world. And a lot of these communities are on the verge of extinction. For instance, Iraq has only 6 Jews left. We've got 30 very elderly ladies living in Egypt. There are perhaps 30 in Syria, 50 in Lebanon, none in Algeria, none in Libya. There are still a few thousand in Morocco and Tunisia, but perhaps 1% of what the community once was.
Now, these refugees were created after 1948, after the War of Independence. But how long had those communities been living in those Arab lands?
Well, as I say, some of them have been there since biblical times. You probably know the verse from the Bible, by the rivers of Babylon, which is what the exiles from Jerusalem sang as they sat by the banks of the Tigris. They remembered Zion. And these were, in fact, the Jews of Babylon who had been in Babylon for 2,500 years until they were forced to leave in the last 50 years.
And what brought about this situation where they were forced out of their homes?
Well, the causes actually predate the creation of Israel. You had rising Arab nationalism, you had Islamic fundamentalism, and you had a sort of totalitarianism that excluded minority communities from Arab states. So it sort of built up through the 30s, and it came to a head with the creation of Israel. There was a terrific backlash against Jews living in Arab countries, and they were accused of being spies. They were, you know, the term Jew and Zionist were more or less interchangeable at that time. People were arrested for basically having Hebrew books or photographs, incriminating evidence. There were hangings. There were people were interned just for being Jews, and life became intolerable for these communities, and they started to leave.
So they were dreadfully persecuted in the lands that they'd lived in for nearly 3,000 years.
Yes, that is true. I mean, the persecution did vary. Sometimes the ruler did protect the Jewish community, as in Morocco and Bahrain, I can think of. But the people were incited against the Jews to such an extent that there were violent pogroms. In Morocco, for instance, some 48 Jews were killed in disturbances in 1948. Even though Morocco was not then independent. So the Jews were more or less powerless in the face of this sort of popular hostility.
Right. Now you're the co-founder of Harif, which is an organisation that perhaps you could tell me rather than me tell you what it is.
Well, it's a UK-based association of Jews from the Middle East and North Africa, and our aim is to organise lectures and film shows and generally promote the history and culture of Jews from this region, bearing in mind that soon there won't be any Jews from the Arab world. You know, they are really, this is the last generation, and their children will no longer have any connection or very little connection with the countries that their parents came from.
So your organisation is there to raise awareness?
Yes, that is correct.
Right. And I think that's what we want to do tonight, is to raise awareness of the situation regarding these refugees and to help our viewers to understand the deeper question of Jewish refugees and to be able to act on that. And that's what we're trying to do here tonight, isn't it, Lynn? Really,
yes,
Do
absolutely.
that. Just for the viewers, if you want to text or SMS, you've got the number on the screen. You can do that, and if you want to ask any questions at all, please do, because it's a new subject to me and it's a new subject to many of you, and we want to learn from Lynn as much as we can. So please use the text and the SMS and the facilities that we can give you to ask Lynn the questions that I know that she can answer. Now, Lynn, we talked about these, who are these Jewish refugees, but how did they actually become refugees in their countries like Iran and Iraq and Yemen?
Well, as I said, they were forced out in many cases by persecution, in some cases expulsion, and they found life intolerable. So you've got this situation where there are practically no Jews left. And they did become refugees because they had no choice but to leave, and they left all their property behind, and they were never given compensation for that property. 600,000 ended up in Israel, where they were housed in tent camps mostly, or little wooden huts, and some of these camps stayed in existence for years, and gradually became permanent towns. But these people arrived with absolutely nothing but the shirts on their backs, and Israel, which actually had no resources of its own and was already trying to cope with Holocaust survivors, had to deal with 600,000 people arriving with nothing. They had to integrate them. It was very, very hard at the beginning, but you won't find any of these people actually calling themselves refugees now, whereas the Palestinians will say they are still refugees after 60 years. But it seems unfair that Israel has had to pay the price, you know, of that they've absorbed all these refugees, and yet they can't claim the credit for it.
Now, when we talk about refugees in these circumstances, and for the Palestinian Arabs as well, they've left their homes, their businesses, their communities, their synagogues, the graves of their family members, and they've left all that, and they've literally, I guess, walked to Israel with nothing. Well,
that is absolutely true, that some of them did walk, literally, and they were completely uprooted, and their tradition and their history and everything has all gone. And there's nothing left, and it's particularly painful that the world actually doesn't know that this happened. These communities, as I say, are virtually extinct now, and it's a great loss, not just to Jewish people, but the Arabs who lived with these Jews and who lived alongside these Jews, because these Jews were in many cases part of the fabric of society. Baghdad was 40% Jewish, and not many people know that. It was probably the third most Jewish city in the world after Jerusalem and Salonika. And Jews were very active in business. They were civil servants, they were tradesmen, they were doctors, and you know, obviously the Arab world was left with a big void when these Jews left.
And lost a lot of opportunities to use the gifts of the Jewish people. I noticed when you sent me some information, and some of that information contained an invitation by the Egyptian government to Iraq, I think it was, to send musicians to Egypt for a concert, and all the musicians from the country were Jewish.
Well, that's true. In the 20s and 30s, I think there were 250 instrumentalists in Iraq who were Jewish, and only 3 Muslim musicians. This was because an extreme imam, or whatever you want to call him, in the 19th century said that it was prohibited for Muslims to play music. So the Jews stepped into the breach, and they formed the backbone of music and music in Iraq. That is very true.
Now, what were the relations like between Jews and Arabs before the establishment of Israel in those lands? Do you know?
Yes, well, there is a propaganda myth that everybody got on extremely well. Jews and Arabs lived very happily together before Israel came along and spoilt everything. But in fact, Jews lived as inferiors to Muslims, Jews and Christians, I should say. They were dhimmis under Sharia Muslim law. And that meant that Jews were subject to certain restrictions. They were allowed to live as Jews, and they were tolerated, but only under certain conditions. For instance, they couldn't build their synagogues higher than a mosque, and in fact churches could not be built higher than a mosque either. Jews couldn't ride horses because that would, a horse was a noble animal. They couldn't testify in court against a Muslim. They couldn't inherit from a Muslim. There were all sorts of restrictions like that. And there were daily humiliations, like a Jew might be pelted with stones if he walked the streets. He might, in Shia Muslim lands, for instance, Iran, Jews were not allowed to touch anything that a Muslim would touch. In other words, if he went to the market and he handled fruits and vegetables, then nobody could buy those fruits and vegetables. There was one awful example I came across in the 19th century. If it rained and a Jew was walking in the street and he brushed against a Muslim and the Muslim got drops of water on him, that Jew could get executed. And there were instances of Jews being executed just for contaminating the Muslims.
Right.
Yeah.
Lynn, we've had a text from Jeff in Leeds, and Jeff asked the question, and it's an interesting question, and I'm sure you can answer it. It says, Lynn, is it not a good thing in the long run that these Jewish people made what Jeff describes as a forced aliyah?
Well, every cloud has a silver lining, and Jeff's right in a way that they probably made better lives outside, but it was nevertheless a terrible uprooting for them. They didn't want to leave, and I think the world should recognize that that they were forced to leave.
Mm. And you visit Israel quite a lot, and you visit some of those people who were refugees, and you will know a little bit about the pain that they've suffered having left their homes. Can you tell us about that?
Well, I'm not sure people know that almost 50% of Israel's Jewish population are descended from Arab and Muslim are descended from refugees from Arab and Muslim countries. If you visit a town like Sderot began as a tent camp actually for Jews from Iraq, Iran and North Africa. And it's definitely important to realize this. Mm. I myself, my parents came from Iraq and they were forced to leave in 1950. And even though, I have no real desire to go back to Iraq, it's still a part of one's identity to know that you came from that part of the world, that your traditions are a bit different, that your cooking is different. I grew up hearing Arabic spoken, and it's just something that people ought to realize.
How did it affect your parents from the emotional point of view, and obviously the material point of view, because they had nothing?
Yes, they were not allowed to take anything out with them. They had to start from scratch, but they rebuilt their lives, and they didn't wallow in self-pity. They didn't feel they were victims in any way. It was very hard for them, especially since they still had relatives who were, I would say, trapped in Iraq, who couldn't get out, because that was also a feature of life as a Jew in an Arab country, that you might have been expelled, but then your relatives might be held hostage. That accounts for the fact that Jews took a while to leave. It was a sort of slow process. It began in 1948, but in fact the last of the Jews did not leave until 10 years ago. They left Syria, for instance, in 1990 when there was a big effort to let them out. But these Arab regimes did tend to keep them as hostages. And I don't think people realise that that's all part of the persecution that they went through.
And even today there is an issue over refugees, Jewish refugees from Yemen. Yes,
that is true. The great majority of the community in Yemen did leave in 1948. They were airlifted out, actually, on the wings of eagles, which you probably know from Isaiah, I think. Comes from a verse in the Bible. And these Jews had never seen a plane before, most of them, and they were terrified. But their rabbis told them, you know, the verse from Isaiah, and then they understood that the planes were taking them to Israel. So, as I say, the vast majority of the community did leave. There were only a few thousand left in Yemen. Now, the last few hundred have been caught up in a civil war. Things are very bad for them, but they're sort of steadily trickling out, and soon there won't be any Jews left in Yemen at all. And it is sad when you consider that community goes back 3,000 years. On the other hand, going back to what Jeff said, these Jews will probably wonder what took them so long to get out, because you know they live in fear. They're being intimidated. They can't work. They have to be supported by the government, and life is not good for them. So I think, on balance, it will be a good thing when they all get out, but it'll be a loss, obviously, to their history, their culture, and their tradition.
Of course. We're getting a lot of texts, Lynn, about this subject, and one of the questions is, and I guess we'll do this at the end, but one of the questions is, how can we find out more about what Harif is doing? Do you have a newsletter and a blog?
I have a website. It's www.harif.org. But if you want sort of more current information about Jewish refugees, I would recommend Point of No Return. If you just Google Point of No Return blog, you'll get to it. And that's updated almost every day with articles and information about Jewish refugees.
I've got another a text from Nira, one of our viewers, and she says, this is a very touching subject to someone like me. I was born in Iraq and had to leave Iraq because of prosecutions and persecutions. I think that's what she means. The Jews of Iraq have been there for more than 2,600 years. We had to leave everything behind and start from scratch without any UN committee to help us. I would like to ask Lynn why the world has been silent about the Jewish Nakba for so many years, and why countries such as Britain and other countries who are advocates of human rights are blind when it comes to the rights of Jews from Arab countries. Thank you for bringing the subject to light, she says.
Well, she's absolutely right. There's been a sort of conspiracy of silence, almost, about Jewish refugees. It's hard to explain it, really. The UN has probably had a big role to play in this, because the UN has a vested interest in only talking about Palestinian refugees. After all, a special agency was set up to care for them exclusively. 101 resolutions have been passed in the UN on the plight of Palestinian refugees, but not a single one about Jewish refugees. So it's absolutely right, and there is no excuse for there being you know, such ignorance about a very important part of the story.
And our United Kingdom government and the American government and some of the EU as a body, have they helped and have they supported any move for compensation for this community of refugees?
They haven't. Jewish refugee rights are mentioned in things like Resolution 242, but such sort of agreements and documents refer to the refugee problem. They don't specify whether the refugees are Arab or Jewish, and a lot of people don't seem to realise this. They think that when the refugee problem is mentioned, it only refers to Arab refugees. So we have a long way to go to educate people and to make sure that Jewish refugee rights are recognised.
Yes, of course. And why haven't we heard about this subject until now? Why is it now that it's being raised and the issue is an issue that may affect the Middle East talks, peace talks?
Well, I think Israel didn't want to raise the subject for a long time because they were busy absorbing these people. They didn't want to drive a wedge between different ethnic communities within Israel. They didn't want them to look back. They wanted them to look forward and build a new life for themselves. And they wanted to create a new Israeli out of all these Jews who'd come from all corners of the world. So Israel didn't feel it was a good idea to raise the subject. Also, I mentioned the Jews in Syria, for instance. The last few thousand were still around in Syria in 1990, and I think there was a concern that if they made too much noise about Jews in Arab countries, there would be negative repercussions on the remnants of these communities still in Arab countries. So I think that was a factor. But all that has started to change now that there are practically no Jews living in the region. And a campaign started about 5 years ago. Two new organizations were set up. One was called Justice for Jews from Arab Countries, JJAC, and that's based in New York. And the other one is in California, and that's called Jumena. That's Jews indigenous of the Middle East and North Africa. And both these organizations started lobbying quite hard and trying to raise awareness. And the result was that the US Congress passed a resolution in April 2008. And that resolution said that no official document could be issued by the US government which mentioned Palestinian refugees without also mentioning Jewish refugees and in fact other refugees from the Middle East. So there has been quite an effort in America to do something about this. Since then, the focus has shifted over to Israel, and in February this year, the Knesset, the Israeli parliament, has passed a law, and this law said that no peace negotiations can go forward without compensation for Jewish refugees being a part of a final peace settlement in the Middle East.
I've got the website for Justice for Jews from Arab Countries. I picked this up off the website, and just for our viewers, if they wanted to get onto that, because it does contain a lot of information and a lot of statistics regarding where the Jewish refugees were from and the dates and the times, and it's a good website to have a look at. It's www.justiceforjews.com. You'll get a lot of information on that website, and it would be good perhaps if you had a look at it. We've got a question here from Chrissy from Wrexham, Lynn, and she says, were Jewish people in Arab lands afraid to say they were Jewish because they were afraid of persecution? Did they hide their Jewishness?
I think in the last 50 years, yes, because they were afraid of being accused of Zionism, basically. I think over the centuries, no. The Jews had their own communities, which were self-governing in some ways. So the Jews were known to be a separate community with a separate with their own synagogues and their own religious courts. And they were actually distinguished at some point by they had to wear different clothing, you know, different colours, so that people would know they were Jews. And so I'd say that it's quite recent, the fact that they've had to hide their Jewishness, and also any affiliation with Israel is obviously not. You know, is not acceptable. You know, in Iran, for instance, the Jews don't show any sort of connection with Israel. They always join in any condemnation, any official declarations on Gaza or whatever it is. They are too afraid to really show their true feelings, and yeah.
Do we know if those Jewish communities in places like Iran who actually were to stand against the tide, do we know if there's any persecution today? Are there executions of Jewish people?
No, there aren't any executions. There were some when the Ayatollahs first took over in 1979. And in fact, I think there've been some 25 to 30 Jews who actually were either executed or have disappeared without trace in Iran. The Baha'i community in Iran has actually been worse treated than the Jews. But there is always this fear, I think, that if they step out of line, if they say something unacceptable, they could be arrested. There are Secret Service people infiltrating, you know, the Jewish community. You never know who might be standing behind you, you know, listening to what you're saying, and so they do live in a kind of fear.
You've mentioned a couple of times now that there are other communities in Arab lands who also face difficulties and persecution. And before the programme you mentioned about Christians and other groups. Can you tell me a little bit about that and how you see the connection between Arab refugees and Christian communities in Arab lands?
Well, I think the Jews are very much part of a sort of very varied fabric of different communities in the Middle East. It's not often appreciated that the so-called Arab world is not Arab and Muslim by any means exclusively, but it contains not just Jews, but Assyrian Christians. We've got Maronites, you've got Copts, you've got sort of very exotic and rare religions like the Mandeans. I don't know if you've heard of them.
No, I haven't.
No, and the Yazidis, who again go back 2,000 years. And these communities are indigenous to the Middle East. They were there well before the Arabs and the Muslims. And what they have in common, the Jews and the Christians, the Mandeans, etc., is that they've all been oppressed in some way. The Jews really were the first community to be ethnically cleansed, I think one should call it. The Christians, unfortunately, are on the way. Assyrian Christians, there used to be about 1.5 million in Iraq. There are now probably half that number. 40% of all refugees from Iraq have been Christian. They are suffering terribly from radical Islam in Iraq, and it is a shame that you know, these ancient communities are really on the way out.
Right. Now, would this question about Jewish refugees, because it is a big question, if we're talking about 850,000 Jewish refugees, and the question mark of compensation, does it affect the Middle East peace talks today?
Well, I think it should do, because any peace talks that don't take account of Jewish refugees would not be based on truth. If you only take account of Palestinian refugee rights and you ignore Jewish refugee rights, that just wouldn't be fair. And you wouldn't have a just peace. Therefore, you know, it's absolutely essential that all the true facts are known and that people realise there is this other set of refugees, not just Palestinians. Mm-hmm. So,
Mr. Netanyahu has made this an issue, I think, on the Middle East peace talks, based on what Mr. Clinton had said in 2000. And I've got that quote, Lynn. I got it from a book called Eurabia. And I'll read what Mr. Clinton said. I know we've mentioned what Camp David 2 earlier in the programme, but I just want to mention for our viewers exactly what he said. He said, there will have to be some sort of international fund set up for refugees. There is, I think, some interest, interestingly enough, on both sides in also having a fund which compensates the Israelis who were made refugees by the war, which occurred after the birth of the State of Israel. Israel is full of people, Jewish people, who lived in predominantly Arab countries, who came to Israel because they were made refugees in their own land. And I think that's quite a clear statement that Mr. Clinton made at that time. Has there been any compensation at all to any single families or any single communities who were Jewish refugees in?
There have been very few examples. I can think of one, and she was not Israeli, she was a British national. She owned a hotel in Alexandria, and she went to court. She sued the Egyptian government who'd taken over the hotel, and she actually won the case after years and years. But then the Egyptian government said to this lady that they wanted to, although they would give this lady her hotel back, they wanted to take it back almost immediately, and they would pay her compensation. And this was, I think, in 1996, this case. It's called the Cecil Hotel. And they've been wrangling over what compensation to pay this lady ever since. I think it would be very low, the compensation. So there is obviously no will at all on the part of Arab governments to pay compensation. It would open up a complete can of worms, especially since Jewish refugees lost perhaps 50% more than Palestinian refugees did. I mean, it's estimated that land that was abandoned by Jews in Arab countries amounts to 4 times the size of Israel itself. And the Arabs, I think, are either not willing or able to pay that sort of compensation. Therefore, Clinton's idea of an international fund, I think, would be a very good solution. Palestinian refugees would be able to benefit, and so would Jews now living, and not just Jewish refugees living in Israel, because of course not all of them went to Israel. About 300,000 Jews went to Europe and the Americas and Australia. So it would be great if those Jews could also benefit from the compensation fund. But I certainly think it's the way forward. Mm.
I was quite surprised when you told me earlier, before the programme, that 300,000 had left for Europe and Australia. How did they travel, and how were they accepted by the countries that took them in?
Well, I think some of them did have connections. They did have family, and some of them already had foreign passports. For instance, in Egypt, there were Jews who had British passports, there were Jews who had French passports, and also Italian passports. So they found it relatively easy to go and live in Europe. The Algerian Jews, for instance, were all French nationals, so they they went to France. Most of them did. Some did go to Israel. But Israel took in those who were stateless and those who had nowhere else to go. Yeah, as I say, I think it was mostly those who had connections, who had family, or already had foreign citizenship, who went to Europe and
so presumably
elsewhere.
They would have been cared for by their families, by their friends, by sponsors, I guess, in some cases.
I think it was very hard for them. I came across one story of an Algerian family who ended up in some slum in Paris. There's sort of 5 of them in one room. Again, it was a question of rebuilding from scratch. And these people got on with their lives. Yeah.
Also, you mentioned earlier on that when the 600,000 to begin with arrived in Israel, they were in tents and in, well, literally refugee camps as we would see today in African countries and where there's been floods, etc., etc. How long were they living like that for?
Well, some of them lived for several years in these conditions. Obviously, these tents got too hot in summer. They were leaking in winter. There was no sanitation. There wasn't enough food, or the food was just not what they were used to. But they survived. And you won't find any tent camps in Israel now.
And that's because they left with a vision, I guess, to establish in a new home, in a new country, and build a new life.
Yeah, I think it was extremely hard for them. I mean, they weren't particularly happy to be in these conditions, and in fact they looked back on their previous life and they thought, my goodness, I've left my home, I've left my business, I've left everything, and here I am stuck in a tent. What's going to happen to me? And of course it was particularly hard for the older people. But what happened was that the new generation went out and they learnt the language, and they got jobs, and they got education, and they guided the older generation into society. But the older generation called themselves the desert generation in Israel because they were actually lost. They had little to contribute in this new place, and they looked to their children to help them out. I mean, you'll get that very, very strongly from Eli Amir's books. Eli Amir is an Israeli author, and he wrote about his experiences in a tent camp, and how he actually helped his father, his parents along, and and how difficult it was for them all. He wrote a book called The Dove Flyer, which talks about his life in Iraq, in Baghdad, and then a second book, I think it's called I can't think of it at the moment, but
Lynn's looking to give you her son, who is in the studio, and he's a lovely young man, and he knows as much about this subject as his mum, really. We'll find that book, and we'll try and
yes, it's a trilogy anyway.
Yeah.
He's written 3 books, and each one deals with different stages in the experience of being integrated into a new society.
Because they wouldn't be able to speak the language, totally different culture, I guess. As you say, totally different food and social.
It was very difficult, and they did complain of discrimination. Like some of them couldn't get jobs because they didn't speak Yiddish. It was a real problem back in the 50s. The Palestinian refugees, on the other hand, who ended up in other Arab countries, had no problems in that sense. Would have had no problems if they'd been allowed to integrate, because they found themselves in an Arabic-speaking environment. The people around them were all Muslim, so it wasn't, I think, as big a change.
Now, I just got a text from, there's no name on it, but it says, Middle East politics, because it shows that the region is full of minorities who have been oppressed by the tide of pan-Arabism. Do you understand the question?
Yeah, he's absolutely right. I was talking about Assyrian Christians, and they were definitely oppressed by pan-Arabism. In fact, the first thing to happen as soon as Iraq became independent was that the Assyrian Christians were massacred. There were 600 Assyrian Christians massacred in northern Iraq, and this was actually the sort of fate that's many of these minorities could expect. I'm not saying that they were going to be massacred, but they certainly were oppressed, and very few of these minorities still thrive, I would say, and a lot of them have left. I'd say the Mandeans are a particularly sorry case, because there are only a few 100,000 of them left. Most of the community is now in Australia, and they really have very little future. The Jews at least had somewhere to go. They had a haven in Israel, and they were lucky in that way.
I've got another question here, Lynn, from a lady called Lily. And she says, Lynn, can you tell us how the Jews of Arab lands were affected by the Holocaust, particularly since the overt alliance between the Mufti of Jerusalem and Hitler and that fact is well documented? Yes.
Well, the Jews were affected by the Holocaust. Tunisia was actually occupied by the Nazis for 6 months in 1942. And Jews were rounded up, they were sent to labour camps, and some of them were sent to concentration camps, and I'd say several hundred died. Jews in Libya were obviously living under Italian fascist rule. They were also rounded up. There was a particularly notorious labour camp called Jado, and 600 Jews died in that camp. There were individual Jews who were sent to Auschwitz and Birkenau. Apart from that, there was Vichy ruled Syria, Lebanon, and Morocco and Algeria, and introduced certain anti-Jewish measures. So of course the Jews did suffer in those countries, but possibly the most worrying, well, not most worrying, but the most overt example of sort of pro-Nazi influence was in Iraq. In Iraq, there was a coup, a pro-Nazi coup, led by a man called Rashid Ali in 1941. Although he only lasted about a month in power, and the British did sort of defeat his forces, he incited the people against the Jews, and a terrible pogrom broke out over 2 days in 1941, and it said about 180 Jews were killed, and that is a sort of result of the Nazi Holocaust, if you like. I mean, it's all part and parcel of that pro-Nazi movement within the Arab world, and a lot of people have never heard of this. They think that the Jews in the Middle East were in fact spared the Holocaust, but it's pretty certain that had the Nazis been victorious in the Middle East, had Rommel not been defeated, the Jews would certainly have been sent to concentration camps and exterminated, just as the Jews of Europe were.
Right. Just a side issue, we've had Gotsu Kasum who's texted us and said, can we just make it clear that you're a co-founder of Harif and not Marif? So for our viewers watching, on the screen you'll see Marif, but actually it's H Hotel, A Alpha, R Romeo, I India, and F Foxtrot. So it's Harif.
Yes,
so just a correction there. And another question from a viewer. We haven't got his name, but he said, where were Palestinians before 1948? Why did Egypt and Jordan not create a Palestinian state when both occupied Gaza and the West Bank before the creation of Israel in 1948? I don't know if that's in your remit, Lynn, but it's quite a direct question.
Yes, it is a direct question. I'm not sure I would be the best person to answer it. Of course, it's a very good question. But perhaps we can move on to something else.
Yes, of course. And we've got a comment from another viewer, and I'm grateful for your comments. And it's from Jay Turner, who says, "Good evening to you both. I suggest that the viewers watch The Forsaken Promise," and that's a DVD. You may not have seen that, but it's an excellent DVD that was produced regarding Israel, in support of Israel. So he just says, can you tell the viewers to watch this, because that does have some information about what we're talking about. Now, I know the viewers would also, some of them would also want to say that from a faith point of view, we believe that as the prophets have said, that Jews will be gathered back to the land, and we see that happening today. And I just want to say that we are aware of that, and here on Revelation we're very up to date with what the prophets have said. And if you would look at Amos 9:14-15, Jeremiah 33:7-11, Jeremiah 31:38-40, and you know many of the scriptures anyway. You're well versed in them, probably better than I am. But we do believe that this is part of God's plan. However, the conditions and the way that these refugees have been created is tragic in the extreme. And I think that also is something that we're grateful to you to bring to us tonight. And although we're looking at a figure of 856,000 people, we are also concerned with those individuals, those families who are affected by that, who've lost all that property and have lost their heritage, as you've quite eloquently explained. But when you look at those individual families today, the children, the second generation, do you know how they feel about that?
Well, let's say that from those 850,000, there are about 2.5 million, 3 million Israelis who originate from Arab and Muslim lands, and that's almost half the population. Now, these Israelis they now feel Israeli. They speak Hebrew, and they don't feel any nostalgia for Arab countries. They probably like the food, but that's about it, really. But there's an interesting phenomenon going on, and that's the third generation is now rediscovering their roots in terms of culture and music, and there is a sort of revival going on in Israel. You find that Arabic music is very popular, Arabic style pop music. There are loads of artists like Sarit Haddad, Ofra Haza, loads of them, and they're very popular. And I think these are the Israelis who are tapping into their Middle Eastern roots.
I know, and I've been down to Sderot a number of times, and I stayed there one Shabbat and had a meal which consisted of chicken in a big roasting tin with rice and boiled eggs in their shells.
Yes,
and the lady said, "That's Moroccan.
Yeah.
I'm from Morocco."
Well, it could have been Iraqi too.
Really? So
yeah, that is a classic Shabbat dish, actually, because as you know, you're not allowed to cook on Shabbat. So the lady of the house would put her chicken in the oven to bake on a very low light with the eggs on a Friday afternoon, and then she'd eat the eggs. The family would eat the eggs, probably with some pickle, for breakfast the next day. So they'd have two meals rolled into one.
So their cultural roots haven't gone away?
No, not at all. In fact, Ashkenazim, people from Europe, have actually adopted certain dishes. And you know, you'll find restaurants offering Moroccan dishes such as the one you've described, and in fact, you know, they're very popular.
Your son Gideon, who's sitting just across the way from us, has texted us and said the book that we need to look at is the one you mentioned earlier, but you couldn't remember it. Was Eli Amir Book's trilogy, The Dove Flyer, The Scapegoat, and Yasmin. He says
absolutely right.
He hopes this helps, Mum. Thank you, Gideon. Thank you. Now, when we started the program, I said at the beginning that really we wanted to equip ourselves as to how we can help, how we can support, and how we can raise awareness ourselves as a Christian community. And I know our viewers would be really keen on activating themselves. So what can we do, Lynn, to do those things?
Well, as I say, in any eventual Middle East settlement has to be based on truth. If we're going to have reconciliation between Arabs and Jews, you can't leave out half the story. So people must know about Jewish refugees. So what I would suggest is for viewers who might be interested in Middle Eastern politics and happen to be reading articles or looking at a TV program that mentions Palestinian refugees and fails to mention Jewish refugees, what I would do is write a letter to the editor or phone up the program, point out that Jewish refugees have not been mentioned and they should be. And I think if everybody did that, that would help a great deal to raise awareness of this very, very important issue.
I think we'd be very busy in doing that, because I've never read in any newspaper or report or on a website or heard from the BBC or ITV or any of the big news companies this question about Jewish refugees raised. Have you any experience of that?
No, it doesn't happen very often. It's happening more and more, I would say, in the American press, in people's sort of talk back comments to articles, but in fact it's pretty well absent from mainstream media. For instance, I had a look at the BBC website today, and they have country profiles, and I looked at Israel and the Palestinian territories, and I found a sort of brief summary of the conflict, and it mentioned Palestinian refugees. It didn't mention Jewish refugees, and this is absolutely outrageous, and something ought to be done about it.
So we can become very active, really, by writing to newspapers and to the main media outlets and say, why haven't you mentioned the subject of Jewish refugees?
Absolutely, absolutely.
Well, Lynn, I want to thank you so much for coming tonight. I've learned so much, and you've been great, and I've been really privileged to interview you, so thank you very much. But thank you to our viewers who've watched the program tonight. Good night to you all. God bless.
Thank you.